Today we're going to be looking at the activism in the economic and financial world of John Maynard Keynes. I've called him the engaged intellectual. Keynes' first major work had to do with the Treaty of Paris at the end of World War I. It was also called the Treaty of Versailles, not to be confused with the Treaty of Paris that ended the American Revolution. He was a harsh critic of the Treaty of Versailles at the end of World War I. In this treaty, the Central Powers, which included Germany, Austria-Hungary, Bulgaria, and the Ottoman Empire, were defeated by the Allies, which included mainly the United States, the United Kingdom, Italy, Belgium, France, Russia, and Serbia. Now, Germany was the leadership of the Central Powers and had been forced into unconditional surrender as a result of the end of the war. And so it was up to the Allies, especially Britain, France, the United States, and Italy, to determine the terms of the treaty which would be imposed on Germany. Often when a combat ends without a clear vanquishing of an opponent, there is a negotiation about things. But in this case, it was essentially an imposed settlement because of the unconditional surrender of Germany. Germany was held accountable for all of the loss of life and property in France and Great Britain in particular, where much of the war had actually been waged. This was a terribly devastating war, the first real world war that the world had ever seen. Not that all countries in the world were involved, but certainly a very vast number were, and there was a mass mobilization. Hundreds of billions of dollars of property were destroyed, and so on. So the treaty determined that reparations had to be specified, and these reparations were huge, included annual payments of gold bullion from Germany which were far higher than could ever be paid. In addition, everything else was taken from Germany: their locomotives, their rolling stock, even entire factories, and agricultural output were taken from Germany and given to France, thus making Germany an impoverished nation. The United States supported this because they had made extensive loans to Great Britain and France, and they felt that if these reparations went through, then they would be repaid out of those reparations. Keynes wrote the book The Economic Consequences of the Peace to lay out his analysis of the treaty and its absolutely impossible economic terms. He concluded that the impact on Germany would be a destabilization of the country, and therefore the likelihood that there would be a resurgent government hostile to the West because people would resent so deeply being forced into such abject poverty. His prediction came true. As hyperinflation in Germany in the 1920s and broad economic weaknesses facilitated the rise to power of Adolf Hitler and the National Socialism or Nazi movement, Hitler was appointed Chancellor by Hindenburg in 1933, and the rest is history, as Hitler attacked a number of countries, put a major focus on attacking the Soviet Union to try to reverse the revolution there, and it was a pretty devastating World War II that came as a result, in part, of the economic consequences of the peace that Keynes had discussed at the time of the treaty. I would say that Keynes's critique, Keynes was actually had been involved in the discussion in the Treaty of Versailles, Treaty of Paris, but his recommendations were ignored. And such was also the case when Keynes was engaged in the Bretton Woods Agreement. After World War II, the advanced industrial nations sought to create a global economic framework to prevent the reemergence of war. They had learned, at least from World War I and then the rise of the Nazis and the rush towards another world war, that it would be best to have a more reasonable economic framework for all countries involved to prevent another World War III. And so this was the Bretton Woods Agreement, which was developed in 1945 to 1946, in that period. And this Bretton Woods Agreement included the formation of the institutions that we've come to know pretty well today: the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and so on. And these were charged with with intervening in international trade and finance when there were challenges of instability due to international imbalances in trade and current account. You know, in the interwar period, there had been almost anarchy in the world trade system, as people would constantly try to devalue their currency to try to get an improvement in their trade, but then other countries would devalue their currency in retaliation, and so you had a real chaos in the interwar period between World War I and then later World War II. And in fact, in the case of the United States, we had the famous Smoot-Hawley tariff, which was a terrible disaster in terms of international trade and the balance of trade in the world scene. Well, Keynes had argued at Bretton Woods that we needed to have some kind of scrutiny over world trade that was more developed than simply an agreement. He advocated the creation of an international unit of account, what he called the Bancor. And this would be allocated to countries according to the size of their economies and trade activities, and would serve a function which I'll tell you about in a second, which is somewhat similar to, not really, but not exactly, but somewhat similar to the international drawing rights that the IMF currently has developed. The Bancor would not be an international currency, but it would be a unit of account, and it could be used to track international flows of assets and liabilities. And so Keynes argued that we would create this international clearing union. This would be a new organization, and that gold could be exchanged for Bancors, but Bancors could not be exchanged for gold. Furthermore, individuals could not hold or trade in Bancor, so that this becomes a unit of account that is used in making decisions about what should be done in the international trade arena. And the idea was to have a neutral way of adjudicating trade imbalances. And so all international trade would be valued and cleared in Bancor. So here's how it would work. Surplus countries, the idea is just to balance international accounts and not have wide discrepancies where you have huge trade deficits or trade surpluses or huge current account surpluses and so on. Countries with a surplus who had excess Bancor assets and deficit countries with excess Bancor liabilities would both be charged to provide symmetrical incentives on them to take action to restore balanced trade. The senior fellow and director of international economics at the CFR, the Council on Foreign Relations, summarized the process in the following way. Each item a country exported would add Bancors to its ICB account, and each item it imported would subtract Bancors. Limits would then be imposed on the amount of Bancor a country could accumulate by selling more abroad than it bought. It conjures up some of the current issues about trade surpluses and deficits with China and so on, and whether or not there's a problem with that. Similar limits were imposed on the amount of Bancor debt it could rack up by buying more than it sold, as in the case of the United States with its tremendous current trade deficit. There would be limits put on that. So the idea was to stop building up excessive surpluses or deficits, because these could be destabilizing in the world economy. So each limits would be proportional, a percentage of its share of world trade. And then once the initial limits had been breached, the countries that were in deficit would be allowed to depreciate, and surplus countries could appreciate their currencies. And that would be mandated, in fact, by the process of the ICB. This would, of course, make the deficit countries cheaper and surplus countries' goods more expensive. That would stimulate a rebalancing of trade on a global sense, in a global sense. Further Bancor debit or credit position breaches would trigger mandatory action, and so for chronic debtors this would include obligatory currency depreciation, rising interest payments to the ICB Reserve Fund, forced gold sales, and capital export restrictions. So the idea was to put teeth into this international trade adjustment process, rather than simply allowing it up to each individual sovereign nation to decide how it's going to act on its own. And similarly, for the chronic creditors, it would include currency appreciation and a payment of a minimum of 5% interest on excess credits, and if it got too much, it would be up to 10%, and all of this would go to the ICB's reserve fund. Now, Keynes never believed that creditors would actually pay what in effect were fines, but he did believe that they would take the necessary actions to avoid them. But this, what seems like a rather reasonable approach, was rejected by the United States representative Bretton Woods. The rejection allowed the US dollar to emerge as the dominant international reserve currency, instead of having a separate international unit of account, or it wasn't actually a currency, it was a unit of account. So the US representative at Bretton Woods understood that they would be giving up a certain amount of sovereignty if they went along with the ICB and the Bancorp process, and they also knew that they were the most powerful economy at the end of World War II, because the European economies and the Soviet economies had all been devastated by the war, but the US had been hurt by the war, but not nearly as much, and so its economy, which had really taken off after World War I, really took off after World War II, and was able to dominate the world with the US dollar as the dominant international reserve currency. And that's, of course, still true today, although that's being challenged in various places, so it's not an entirely stable situation. Keynes' advocacy for the Bancorp, of course, may not have been purely internationalist in thinking. Britain had previously had the pound sterling had been the international currency of account, and it would like to have diluted the rising power of the US dollar. So I don't think we should say that Keynes was simply being, a neutral internationalist, but certainly his advocacy for the Bancorp would have helped Britain maintain a stronger role in the world economy if it had been adopted. Now, so Keynes was again here a major player at Bretton Woods, but his international proposals were rejected by the U.S., which was determined to assert its dominance, and it has done so through today.